everyone who's here. I'd like to welcome Bruce McGregor, Dr. Bruce McGregor, who is here to talk to us about our goat grazing essentials and managing our Angoras and stocking rates. So basically, Bruce will take it away, and because he can't see us or the live chat during this webinar, if anyone has any questions, just use the raise your hand button or write something in the chat, and I'll let Bruce know that there's a question. There will be time at the end if you wish to ask questions then. Okay, so welcome, Bruce.
Welcome everyone. Thank you for having me and thanks for joining. So we're going to talk about grazing issues. There's quite a bit of material to cover, so hopefully that will come across, but we can always do more webinars on topics if there's special interest. So I'm going to go into screen share, and there's a PowerPoint presentation that's going to follow. So grazing essentials, managing Angoras and stocking rates. So there's several topics here which we've put into one talk to try and make it as efficient. You can see there that I spent many years working for Victorian Department of Primary Industries, and all of the work that I'm going to refer to was undertaken while I was there, and the funding and so on I can describe if people are interested, but it was very important that what is now known as AgriFutures and their precursors have supported this work right through. And some of the research papers took a little while to be published, but all of this material has been published in science papers. So if you really want to know a great deal of information, those research papers are available. So the four main topics to cover tonight are an outline about goats and their adaptations. So I find this important to talk about adaptations. Many people are familiar with sheep or cattle, and if we're describing goats to new farmers or farmers who are familiar with sheep and cattle, then I find it important to start to distinguish between the species and what the different adaptations are. So that's a little bit more on the biology of the animals. I'm then going to talk about a grazing experiment that I undertook on temperate pastures and describe the main findings. And that will lead directly into insights in relation to managing internal parasitism, because that was a big problem, and it can be a big problem. That was a very big problem with Angora goats and with cashmeres in the wetter environments. And as a consequence of that work, we're just going to have a very brief discussion about reducing some of the major risks. So if there's new farmers being introduced to Angoras or cashmeres, what are the big hazards to avoid, be aware of? I mean, we don't want people sort of reinventing the wheel here. And I think that's been a problem over the decades, that there are some people who have been attracted into farming goats, but they haven't been made aware of the risks, and the risks can be quite large. And I don't think it's helped the industry expand when we avoid talking about what are real risks. So the first part is a little bit about goats and some of their biology and how you might farm them. So certainly for newer farmers, managed goats are docile and they're likeable animals. Many people are familiar with feral goats, or they hear lots of stories about goats being problematic, but farm goats are in a sense no different from farm sheep or cattle. They can be managed if you arrange things properly, and they can be rogue animals with sheep and cattle, and similarly for goats. Most people can safely manage goats. These days, of course, it's a lot of equipment developed to be more for safety purposes with cattle and sheep, and it's similar with goats. There are pieces of equipment that can help, but for most able-bodied people, they can manage the goats. And particularly, they can be handled quite well once they've learnt routines. So goats are good at learning routines, and they're used in abattoirs, for example, to help manage sheep, because once the goat learns a routine, it knows exactly what to do. And so again, newcomers to handling goats sometimes have a lot of trouble in the early period of their managing of goats because the goats don't know what the routine is, or the routine is a bit weird. So getting good routines is very important. They'll know what to do. Goats are inquisitive and agile, and that can be good, or can lead to problems. So some of the problems with goats are because they're inquisitive, and because they're agile, they can get into places perhaps they shouldn't be. And as a sort of more broad general statement, we know that goats are fairly similar to sheep in many ways, but they have particular and specific needs which we need to talk about. And in particular, fencing is one of those specific needs. So all farm animals have specific fencing requirements. If you've got cattle or sheep or pigs or chickens or geese or whatever, horses, they all have a particular requirement for fencing. So it should not be a surprise that goat requirements will differ from some other more common farm animals. So I'm not going to talk about fencing in detail here tonight, but that's important to say and just put it on the table. So domestic goats can be easy and fast to muster once they know the routine. So for many farmers, particularly larger scale farmers, they want to know how this works, and it can work very well. Stockmen who worked for me over many years initially were somewhat hesitant about managing goats, but in the end, after several years, they realised that goats were very quick to muster, and they, instead of doing it at the end of the day, if there was something needed to be done, they would do it at the start of the day because they knew it would be fast and quick, and that can be quite advantageous. Now, when it comes to adaptations, there are actually three topics I want to talk about. One is the mixed feeding behaviour of goats. I just want to discuss that for a minute. I want to talk about morphological adaptations and biochemical adaptations. So when it comes to mixed feeding behaviour, people who've studied this in detail in many different places around the world have determined that goats would be better described as intermediate grazers. They're intermediate between what you might call grazing animals and browsing animals. Now, I'll explain this in a moment with a diagram. And the reasons they come to these conclusions is because goats can be very selective, but they're also flexible and opportunistic. And some of that relates to their inquisitive behaviour, and some of it relates to them being agile. But let's have a look at the diagram. So this is work that was published some years ago. It's what's called an ordination. They're trying to separate out different grazing animals, and there's three parts of this figure that I want to talk about. So the first one on the left-hand side is a selectivity axis. So selectivity, low selectivity animals are animals like cattle or elephants, for example, that will tend to eat lots of different herbage, and they aren't very selective, certainly in comparison to the high selectivity animals like some of the antelopes. So that's the selectivity axis. And on the other axis at the bottom here is the grazing and browsing axis. So grazing animals are usually referred to those who just eat pasture, what's growing on the ground, and we basically have here cattle and buffaloes as examples. And for browsing animals, there's a whole lot of animals like giraffe and deer, and some of the small antelopes, which will spend their time eating and selecting very carefully leaves and shoots of plants. So the animals we're most interested in here today, goats, sheep, and perhaps cattle. And you can see that these arrows on the diagram are showing the sort of flexibility of the animal. So these are generalizations, but they're sort of important directions for the flexibility of animals. So goats can become quite selective and just eat the leaves or flowers of plants. We see that with some of the weed control work that's been done. In some cases, goats just eat the flowers and not anything else. But they can also become grazers and more similar to sheep. So there's a bit of an arrow there for sheep. People know that sheep can browse. If you're growing plantations on your farm, you don't want sheep going in there because they'll tend to strip the leaves off a lot of bushes and shrubs. and that's problematic. So we're not saying these animals don't do any browsing, but these are the main sorts of behaviours that you'll see, and goats are really quite flexible. That's the key point here. Now, some of this is enabled by morphological adaptation. So these are things to do with the animal, the form of the animal. So goats have what's called a split lip, and so do sheep. That helps them grab hold of leaves in particular. So a classic, if you want to see really good lips on an animal, go and look at the giraffe in the zoo. They have very long lips. They are trying to remove leaves off thorny bushes. So that is an extreme example of that type of adaptation. Goats tend to have a narrower jaw compared with many of the common sheep breeds and cattle. That's useful if you're trying to get into thorny bushes. You don't want to be pricked and injured. So a narrower jaw is an adaptation for being more selective. And goats also tend to have curved lower front teeth, or incisors in the bottom jaw. Many animals have been selected by breeders over the decades to have straight mouths. Cattle are classic, that tends to be straight across, very good for grazing, not so good for browsing. And goats also tend to have longer legs, so at any particular size, mass, weight, goats tend to have longer legs than most of the common farm breeds. So as I was saying, some of these adaptations are good for browsing, but they could be disadvantageous in grazing in particular conditions. So here's an example from some of my work. So this is in southern Victoria. The top photograph here is showing an ungrazed annual pasture in spring. And if you look at that, you can see there's plenty of grass coming, and there's little clumps of clover coming up in this pasture. And then after grazing for a few weeks by goats, by Angora goats, you can see here that the goats have grazed down all of that grass and have tended to leave the clumps of clover. So under that particular circumstance, the goats were being very selective. They initially ate the long grass, but after a while they were eating the shorter grass. The short grass was shorter than these clumps of sub-clover that was in this pasture. So being quite flexible and very selective. And that was shown at a bigger scale, on a paddock scale. So here again is some annual pastures. These are grazing plots in an experiment, and you can see on the left-hand side grazed by sheep. On the right-hand side was actually goats and sheep, but it was very low grazing pressure, and so the goats were not selecting the clover here, they were avoiding it, and so it started to become a bit clover dominant in this particular case. So this selection process is not necessarily just on one plant or another. It can be shown on a larger scale. Depends on the circumstance. And to further illustrate the point, these are two photos taken 6 months apart, and this fence line separates low stocking rate sheep in this particular study. This is a very low stocking rate for sheep, merino sheep, and on the right-hand side we have Angora goats at low stocking rate. So similar to the last photo, you can see there's more clover in the goat paddock compared to the sheep paddock. 6 months later, the structures of the pastures look quite different. What we find here is actually there's a similar amount of pasture in both of these paddocks. There's a similar amount of green and dead. It's just in different parts of the pasture. So here the sheep have been grazing close to the ground. Here the goats have effectively grazed from the top down. So I can talk more about that later, but goats are changing their behaviour. One hand here in spring, they were tending to graze the short grass. In summer and autumn, they were tending to graze the long dead material. And if you took close-up photographs of this is the sheep pasture during summer where the sheep were nuzzling along. There's a little bit of clover germinating here based on a summer rainfall, but you can see they're acting like a bit of a vacuum cleaner there, whereas the goats have only eaten the leaves and the taller material and the ground's pretty much covered. So we just talk about some biochemical adaptations. So this is more broad. This is based on work done in many countries, not necessarily in our part of the world, but under arid conditions, it's been shown that goats that are adapted to those conditions can digest lignin and cellulose better than other ruminants. So lignin and cellulose is the structural component of plants, and lignin is generally the harder material. Like there's a lot of lignin in wood, for example, or dead grass stalks. And generally that material is harder to digest. So there's some advantages for goats compared to sheep or cattle. It's also been shown that the microorganisms in the rumen flora, can also differ. This work's difficult to do and it hasn't been fully investigated, but there are reports showing that the rumen microorganisms differ. And another biochemical adaptation is that goats seem to be able to neutralize the negative effects of tannins, which are found in plants. So some of the browse plants have a lot more tannin. Tannins can be sort of good or bad, but if there's a lot of tannins, it will affect the palatability or the desirability of those plants and the digestibility. So that's how much is absorbed by the animal. So if you can neutralize some of the negative effects of tannins, then that gives the goats a biochemical advantage. And also connected to these differences is that there appears to be an increased retention of urea by the animal. So urea is a byproduct of the digestion of proteins and nitrogen by the animal, and it relates to kidney function. But urea is recycled by all of these grazing animals in their saliva. There's a lot of saliva production, and so if you can retain more urea, then you can recycle it into the rumen, and that helps with the first point about the digestion of lignin and cellulose. You need nitrogen in the rumen to keep the microorganisms active and growing. So there are some sort of chemical advantages here in terms of how the rumen operates. And the last point is there's evidence that the goats can be more efficient when it comes to water use. This is not always true, but we've mentioned the rumen and saliva and kidney function, but there is evidence that in certain arid conditions that can be a benefit or a difference between goats and sheep. The other things that happen, there are other behavioural differences that relate to adaptation. So there's been a few studies undertaken that show goats will tend to walk further during the day than comparative other grazing animals like sheep. And so that allows them in some cases to survive water deprivation. So this is going to be arid country. If they can walk further, that means they can camp in safer places and then graze further from water supplies. So that really applies to goats in the more of the semi-arid rangelands or more arid zone. It's not going to be relevant on a smaller farm where there's water that's reticulated around the farm. There are differences in preference for these tastes. So salty taste, sweet taste, sour and bitter. There are differences between goats and sheep in their preferences, which help them when it comes to browsing or eating plants at particular times. And the studies that have been published show that goats can select diets that are higher in energy and protein compared with sheep under exactly the same conditions but relatively poor grazing conditions. So the sum total of all of those things gives goats an advantage in particular places, particularly more arid and environments and places where there might be browse. So having said all that, I now just want to talk about grazing studies that I undertook on annual temperate pastures in southern Victoria. Why southern Victoria? Well, that's where I worked. We were able to get this work funded, and there was a lot of interest in encouraging farmers on annual temperate pastures to diversify. So we're talking about the wheat sheep zone in Australia, which was more than a third of all of the grazing animals are in that zone. And so if sheep farmers were going to put goats on their properties, how would this happen? What would be the impacts? What would they need to watch or manage? Just how did it go? And there are a number of things being told to farmers or promoted to farmers about how this might work. So the key thing here is the key principle is what is being described as the stocking rate. Stocking rates are usually talked about in terms of dry sheep equivalents in Australia, and a DSE, a dry sheep equivalent, is usually described in these sorts of terms as being the energy that's required to maintain a non-breeding 45 kilo merino weather sheep for 1 year. Now, some places they talk about a 50 kilo sheep. It doesn't really matter. That's the key. The key issues have been underlined here. It's about energy. It's not about other nutrients. So you might be able to satisfy the energy requirements, but have some other problem like trace minerals or something like that. We're talking about the broad energy to maintain the animal so they're not growing, they're not lactating, and they are not pregnant. And it's a particular weight. So 45 kilo sheep, roughly the adult size. I mean, it could be 50, doesn't really matter. It could be 60. Some countries talk about stock units, but they're all talking about a similar idea here about the energy for a non-breeding animal, and it's an idea for a year. So the concept is you might have a farm that could, for example, manage 10,000 DSE, a big farm, or 20,000, or if you're buying a smaller property, maybe 1,000 or 500. That will give you a broad idea of the maximum stocking capacity. So if you could run 1,000 DSE, in theory, you could have 1,000 45 kilo merino sheep. We'll come back to this idea at the end of the talk, but it's important because it's involved in designing the experiment that I'm about to describe. So this is the design of an experiment that ran for more than 3 years, and we compared 2 animal species. So we had Angora goats and we had fine wool merino sheep, and we had 2 different grazing strategies. So for each of the Angora goats and merino sheep, we had separate grazing. So the experiment in that case only had goats, or it only had sheep. And we also had a mixed grazing treatment. So 50-50. So half of the animals were Angora goats and half were merino sheep. And we had 3 stocking rates, which are shown here as 7.5, 10, and 12.5 dry sheep equivalents per hectare. Now we chose these numbers very carefully because at the site, the experimental site, there'd been work published about the long-term stocking rates for sheep, and it was 10 DSE was a recommended stocking rate. So these numbers are 25% greater and 25% less. So when you work all that out, we've got 3 combinations of animals. We've got only goats, only sheep, and 50-50, and we've got 3 stocking rates. So that's 3 by 3 is 9 treatments, and we had 2 plots for each of those treatments. So there are 18 little paddocks, and so I'm going to go through with you some of the key findings. Some of this is not new, but some of it is certainly following this experiment was very new information. So what we've got here, this is a graph showing the live weight of animals here on the left-hand side, and then the time as the experiment progressed. And the 3 lines represent Angora goats at, so we've got the mixed graze treatments here. We've got the Angora goats here at 7.5 per hectare. The middle line is 10 per hectare, and then the red line at the bottom is the 12.5 per hectare treatment. So what happened? There were big seasonal effects because this is annual pastures. So you can see here in the spring that the animals grew very quickly every spring. There's a lot of live weight gain during that time. We then have the summer period and autumn where the pastures mature, they dry off, nutrient quality is quite low, and the animals lose weight. So when this experiment started in early spring, all the paddocks were similar. The animals went on the same weight. We made sure they all had similar starting points, and you see it took about 6 months for the stocking rate effect to take place. And then over time, on average, the animals on average became heavier, they grew. There was a stocking rate effect. The lines are significantly different. And this graph also shows the impacts of some animal health issues, particularly here, where you can see during spring at low stocking rate, the animals were growing, but not these animals here. They lost weight. Talk about that in a minute. And this particular graph also stops at this point. I'm going to talk about that as well. So just to show, I'm not going to show you all the graphs. We're just going to show 2 more graphs. This is the live weight graph for low stocking rate animals. And we have solid lines are the live weights of the separately grazed animals. So the green line at the top of the sheep, you can see that on average the sheep were heavier than the goats. We couldn't do anything about that. These were commercially sourced goats. We bought a whole lot from a farm of nearly 200. We had to select about half of those to go into the study. And similarly, these were same age merino sheep from a commercial source. They were smaller size merinos. We could have bought bigger framed animals, but we wanted them to be closer in weight, but they were heavier, and they stayed heavier, as you can see here through the trial. So the 2 lines, the dotted line, the mixed graze ones, and you can see here at the low stocking rate, there's very little difference between the sheep that were grazing by themselves and the sheep that were grazing with the goats until the last year, when the separately grazed sheep tended to be a bit heavier. I'll unpack that in a moment. And then for the goats, those lines are basically parallel. There's no real difference. There's no statistical difference between the goats at low stocking rate. Effectively, they had plenty of food. They grew. These were the older genotype in Australia because this work was done before we could get consistent lines of imported goats. But that's the mean live weight. If we look at the high stocking rate situation, is the live weight again, and the 4 years of the study. So what we're finding here, the solid line is the sheep grazing at 12.5 by themselves, and you can see their seasonal change. And the lines are similar compared with the mixed grazed animals until about halfway through the second full year, when the separately grazed sheep become heavier. So these are the sheep grazing with the goats, and they stay heavier for the rest of the study. So it took about 2 years for this impact to happen, but then the separately grazed, the mixed grazed sheep tended to be heavier. Now, if we look at the goats, so remember these goats are grazing with these sheep. So the solid line goats are grazing with the solid line sheep. And you can see here that through the study, they were generally smaller, but at certain times there was very little difference in weight. The sheep at high stocking rate tended to damage their pastures, and they lost a lot of weight this particular year. We had to actually go and give them some extra supplementary feeding because we didn't want the sheep to die. They lost a lot of weight here because they caused a lot of pasture damage, and the differences, these aren't statistically different weights, these are similar. And the other point to make here is these are the mixed grazed goats at the high stocking rate, and you can see here within a 6 months or so, the goats that grazed with sheep at the high stocking rate were lighter than the goats that were grazing by themselves. And the line stops here. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. So what was happening here was competition. In this case, the sheep, the mixed graze sheep, were winning the grazing competition, and the goats in that circumstance were losing. This is high stocking rate. This is 20% above the recommended stocking rate. The sheep were winning and the goats were losing. And what's happening here is the pastures are very short. The goats are not as well adapted to grazing short pastures, and they were put at a disadvantage. And it shows in two ways in this graph. One is the health issues, which relate to internal parasitism. You can see here that their live weights declined. The sheep perhaps had a bit of a challenge, but they didn't really suffer. But the goats did, and we had to intervene here to keep the animals alive. We had to give them extra treatments for internal parasites. And at this point, a lot of them died. And I'll explain how that happened in a few small slides. So I'll just go back a slide. Very low stocking rate. This is 25% under recommended stocking rate. There was no real competition. Maybe the sheep did a little bit better, but really not substantially better. At 25% above the recommended stocking rate, sheep won, and the goats were being out-competed. So we'll just put up some of the pasture information. We can talk about pasture composition and so on if you want to, but that would have to be on another time. But as you increase stocking rate, there's more animals and they eat more of the pasture, and so the available pasture declines. And that's found in all of the studies. There's been many, many studies done. This is not new, but that's what was happening. The high stocking rate animals on average had about half of the pasture that was available. And if we put all of those 9 treatments up, what we see here with sheep is that the amount of pasture declined down to 1,000 kilograms per hectare here. With the mixed grazed animals, you can see the numbers are higher than the sheep. So the sheep in these mixed grazed paddocks had more pasture to eat. That explains why they were able to grow more and were heavier. And the goats, this is the goats, goat-only treatment. You can see here on average, at low stocking rate, there was no real difference. But as stocking rate increased, there seemed to be more pasture available in the goat paddocks, certainly compared with the mixed or the sheep. So the goats here weren't grazing as efficiently. There was more material lying on the ground, which I showed you before as litter. And if you put sheep in there, these sheep are able to use some of that material, which explains why they're heavier. So the mixed sheep, in this case, were able to use some of the pasture that the goats weren't using. Now I've got a graph here just to give you a summary, a relative effect of the stocking rate and the treatments on the amount of fleece. Now I haven't put up the fleece weights because, as I was saying, these are the older genotypes of Angoras. They didn't grow as much mohair as modern types, so it's not much point talking about the actual kilos, but the relative amount has been set at 100. So this is a relative amount, and that's set for what was produced at 10 per hectare, assuming 10 per hectare was the right sort of stocking rate. So if we look at the sheep, for example, the open bar here, the white bar, is for the mixed grazed, at least for the separately grazed animals, and the mixed grazed animals are shown in the black bar. So there's a very small difference here, not significant in terms of fleece production. They grew roughly 12% more than 10 per hectare, but the sheep that were in the mixed treatment grew a lot more wool relative to that. So the sheep by themselves grew 100 units. These ones with grazing with the goats grew more like 112, and then the differences are even more substantial at 12.5 per hectare. So wool production went down 100 back to about 93, but For the sheep grazing with goats, their wool production was about 104. So that was quite a big difference. And if you look at the goats, a similar thing happened, relatively speaking. So the mixed grazed goats tended to grow more mohair, similar to what was happening here with the sheep. But at the high stocking rate, the goats grew a lot less. So here they're growing about 87 units here, whereas if they'd been at 10 per hectare, they would have grown 100. So these goats are losing out. This is this competition effect. The sheep growing relatively more, goats growing relatively less because they're smaller. The sheep are bigger, the goats are smaller. They're losing that competition. Now the third issue that I want to talk about briefly is the impact on internal parasites. So we put quite a bit of effort into this, trying to understand the broad impacts of the grazing and the mixed grazing and the stocking rate on the goats relative to the sheep. So in this annual pasture system at the time, the Tristrongylus worms were the main worms. There were some other internal parasites. We have a lot of detail on this. I'm not going to go into that today, but the Strongyla were the main ones. We did fecal egg counts, FECs, and we also did total worm counts, which I'll talk about in a minute. So if we look at just the sheep fecal egg counts were low. When we it didn't matter whether we had goats grazing by sheep grazing by themselves or mixed with goats, the fecal egg counts were low. There was a difference with stocking rate, but it wasn't very much really. If you look at the goats, the goat fecal egg counts were higher, but they also went up with stocking rate. And if you looked at the mixed grazed goats, at the low stocking rate, if anything, the egg counts were lower, but at the high stocking rate mixed, they were higher. So going back to what we've already talked about, these goats are grazing with these sheep. So that helps because the sheep aren't producing many fecal eggs. There's less parasites around. And so these goats, this is lower than that because these goats are grazing with these goats. They're all in together. The wether sheep here are helping. But at the high stocking rate, remember that the sheep are getting bigger and the goats are suffering relative to these ones. The goats are much worse off. That's quite dangerous. And some of those goats, we had a few mortalities which were identified as being due to excessive eggs, even though we're monitoring it very carefully. It's tricky doing these studies. You don't want to interfere. You want the biology to play out. But by the same token, you've got to watch the welfare of the animals. So we did as best we could to try and minimise problems. But we needed it to play out because there were many farms that have been in this circumstance where they haven't paid enough attention. Now, if we look at the actual worms, so the worm numbers, so at the end of this study, the animals were slaughtered, and as well as their carcass composition and a few things like that. The main reason we slaughtered them was because we needed to do the total worm counts. You can only do this once. So we've got the fecal egg counts here. This is at the end of the study. The animals are 3.5 years old nearly, and you can see the worm counts for sheep are fairly low, and it's high stocking rate, they're greater, and it didn't matter whether the sheep were grazing by themselves, as a wether sheep, or whether the sheep were grazing with the goats. They're similar numbers. We look at the goats, just look at the separately grazed goats for a minute. The goats had a lot more intestinal parasites, and it went up to a much greater number, nearly 8,000. And if you look at the mixed graze treatment, what we see here is really interesting because the goats mixed graze at low stocking rate had much lower total worm numbers, intestinal parasites, and at the high stocking rate when the goats were being outcompeted, very high numbers indeed. So this is a problem. That is a problem, and that's not, you don't want to be there. This work has helped inform advice on internal parasite control for goats now for 3 decades. Now, what have we got next? I'm just going to highlight a few things. So this one here, mixed grazing at low stocking rate. So these sheep are grazing with those goats. It didn't cause a problem for the sheep. If you look at the worm numbers or the fecal head counts, these sheep, if you compare it with these numbers, they're the same sorts of numbers. So the fact that you've grazed some goats with sheep, these are weather sheep, didn't cause a problem. These sheep are big enough to withstand this sort of challenge, not a problem. And these goats are certainly a lot better off compared with these ones. Because what? Why? Because these goats are grazing with the sheep. They're not grazing with other goats that are showing some vulnerability here. So we're getting close to the end of this talk. What we've got here is just trying to bring some of this together, reducing major risks to the mohair enterprise. So we've talked about a couple of risks. We've just been talking about internal parasites. So how do you reduce the risk there? The answer from this work was that grazing Angora goats with sheep at or near the recommended stocking capacity, which in this case was about 10, will provide benefits in managing internal parasites for the goats. So farmers who want to run a lot of goats, the recommendation, this implies that it'd be better not to just have goats on your property. It would be better to have some sheep on there as well, because in a sense, they're acting as a bit of a vacuum cleaner. They can resist some of those internal parasites, and that would work fairly well. But grazing goats at higher stocking capacities will increase internal parasite burden, so that's a negative. Some people have suggested that you can graze more goats than sheep, and this work says, well, that is a risk, and the work suggested you do that, and the risks become clearer when we get to the next point, which is weather stress deaths, and particularly in terms of trying to manage that risk, the value of body condition scores. So we could talk about body condition scoring a lot. I'm just going to summarize it here, but I've done a lot of work over the years looking at body condition scores and what it means in terms of nutritional monitoring, fleece production, welfare, and meat. We're going to talk here more about the welfare risk here, but body condition scoring is based on what we used was palpating or feeling the short ribs, which is in this part of the animal near its rump. So you've got the ribs here, and then you've got the backbone area on what's called the short ribs. And a really skinny goat, which is given a score of 1, or some people have used 0. There's very little flesh present on the short ribs. So you can see, if you felt that by the hands and fingers, it would be a depression there. And the condition scoring is giving an idea of how much body reserves are present. With a animal which is in what often is called store condition, there's more flesh. If the feeling wouldn't be a depression, it would be more flat. As the animals become better condition, they have more body reserves, they're starting to get a bit more fat in their body, it will be rounded, and higher condition scores, you can get up to 5. You can't actually feel the bones. If an animal's condition score 5, you cannot feel. There's so much muscle and fat that you cannot feel it. So I was assigning condition scores with intermediate scores, so I'd actually have scores in between here. So the equivalent of, say, 1.3, 1.72. We have a whole lot of scoring of the animals, and we did this very regularly, and we weighed the animals as well. Not going to talk about that, but the condition scoring is very interesting because we had a very severe weather event, and this graph is showing the differences between the different paddocks. So we had 12 paddocks at different, remember, we've got different stocking rates. We have different combinations of animals. So here we've got goats by themselves and the mixed goats, and we had several paddocks for each treatment. And it's also got a mortality score. Now this weather event occurred 6 weeks off shears. So it wasn't a surprise to me that goats might be vulnerable to off-shear weather. That's been documented in other countries where Angora goats are kept. But this is an experiment that's been designed to see what happens on commercial farms, which can be large and which often have little shelter, and where farmers are being told that they can run goats easily. So let's look at the results. So this is the mortality rate. So 0 means no animals died. 1 means they all died. And you can see here there's a range of scores where there's some big scores here where quite a lot of animals did not survive. And there's paddocks here where no animals died at all. So this is can be a bit confronting, but this is all at the same time. So at the same time that we had animals that were condition score averaging 3.2, we also had animals that had a body condition score of 1.5. So some people say, well, we have trouble getting our goats fat. Well, that might be telling you something about the nutrition of the animal. It certainly is, but it's also telling you something about the risk, because the mortality was highly related to body condition score. So down to about 2, body condition scores above 2, basically very little or no mortality. And once the body condition score got down to 1.7 or below, then mortality became an increasing problem. So measuring body condition score in this circumstance, really important. Remember, these animals are all in adjacent paddocks. There's no difference in weather or shelter or anything. They've all copped the same weather conditions. The conditions were continuous rain for more than 24 hours, and it wasn't forecast to be that severe, but that's what happened. So just unpacking this a little bit more, Angora goats are shorn twice a year, and so have twice the period of exposure to compared, say, with merino sheep. Now, during the course of this study, there was a very severe weather event in December in Western Victoria where a whole lot of sheep died off shears. So it's not that merino sheep aren't vulnerable here, but the period of vulnerability is much greater with Angoras, partly because they're shorn twice a year. And that means that for a lot of the year, they have half the fleece that a merino sheep might have. So in terms of insulation, this is a risk. And there's more information about this, but basically cold, wet, windy weather is really a serious issue, and it can impact on the requirements of the energy for the goats. So after about 4 hours of bad rain, heavy rain and wind, colder temperatures, the animals start to really draw on their body reserves. And so the recommendation here in terms of minimising risk is that using appropriate body condition scoring and the appropriate stocking rate is really important. Now, when it came to analysing this result, this experience, the live weight of the animals was not the significant factor. We had all the live weights. I mean, I knew everything about these goats. We'd weighed them at least once a month for several years before. I knew all about them. I knew how much fleece they grew. I knew their body condition. And so we could look at, was it the live weight or the change in live weight? Was it the stocking rate? Was it the body condition score? Was it change in body condition score? The most significant factor by far, by absolute mile, was the body condition score at the time of the event. So you could, if you knew what the weather alert system was, you could draft out the animals with low body condition score. So if you had limited space to protect them, or you could only get so many in the shearing shed, you could go and do that. So all these lower condition score animals, will protect them first. You could do that. We know goats will use shelter, certainly if they're familiar with its location. And so the recommendation there is to provide shelter. It doesn't always work. At the time, I spoke to many farmers around southern Australia, and quite a number of them told me that they had goats dying in severe weather, where the goats were caught out in a big paddock, in the middle of a big paddock. One farmer told me they'd lost, 300 animals because a big storm came over, a very intense storm, and the animals clearly did not have time. So it comes back to this critical question about grazing and goats. What is the stocking rate, and what does it mean? So stocking rates are described in terms of dry sheep equivalents or stock units. This is about energy requirements. This is the ballpark approach. It works very well most of the time, and it's something which impacts your grazing numbers. So the sorts of stocking rate equivalents would be, for example, ewes and lambs, 2.5 to 3.1. This depends, of course, on how big they are. So if you've got ewes that weigh more than 45 kilos, then the DSE requirement will be greater. And if you've got pregnant and lactating animals, then they need more energy to run a pregnancy and a lactation. Similarly for lambs, a growing lamb at 25 kilos, the DSE requirement is more than 1. You might say, well, it weighs less than 45. That's true. But the DSE is for the maintenance of a 45 kilogram animal, and that is not the same as what a growing lamb would need. So similarly, does and kids, the DSE requirement here, I have listed it at a higher number than for ewes and lambs, but this depends on how many kids they have. So goats tend to have more kids than, say, merino sheep, but they may not have more than some of the newer fat lamb breeds. So this is all about twinning and the importance of feeding the kids well so they will grow. So then there's other numbers here which just basically relate to the size of animals and their shearing vulnerability. So Angoras are shorn twice a year, therefore their energy requirement will be higher, especially if you want to keep them alive. So if you don't feed them properly, don't expect them to grow. And so you can have targets here for breeding does. I've just got some suggested targets here based on what we think is best practice. So these are the numbers we just mentioned. If animals are fed like that, they'll have good body condition scores. You may need supplementary feeding, depends on when you kid and the seasonal conditions. And in certain areas with wet winters, iodine supplementations are probably required. It depends on the soil type, but some areas with long wet winters, that's very important for kid survival. So look, thank you for bearing with me while we've worked through this. It's a lot of information. I just want to summarise by going through some myths that I have encountered over the years, and this is related to what I've been told and what I've read in the past, and the work I've described to you actually debunk some of these myths. So some people say that goats are very hardy. What they're really meaning is that they can survive in some of the semi-arid zones where there's browse, there's probably shelter, and there's water available. But in other conditions where the goats are shorn, we're at high stocking rates, I've just explained to you how goats aren't hardy in those conditions. They're just as vulnerable as any other animal, particularly if they're poorly fed. Are goats browsers? Well, they can be, but they graze a lot, and on improved pastures or annual pastures, there won't be much browse. We can talk more about browsing and weed control in a separate event. Are goats less selective than sheep? Some people say goats will eat anything. So that's the next point. These are connected. Well, they don't. They can be quite selective, and that can be to their detriment in grazing situations where feed becomes limited. There's an argument that because they're browsing, they eat the plants that are tallest first. That's not necessarily true. I showed you a photograph of that earlier. If they're selective, they're going to be choosing what they think is good at the time. It could be the highest part of the plants. If there's bushes and shrubs, it could be, but it may not be. In America, in the United States, in Texas, where some of these ideas developed, the grasses there are very poor quality, and so the shrubs and bushes are actually quite good quality. So the goats in, say, southern US are much more likely to be browsing because that's good quality food, and the grasses are pretty terrible. So that's not helpful here at all. Goats need roughage for best growth. Well, what do you mean by that? We can unpack that, but the best growth rates we ever had with our goats were during spring, and that's when the pastures are growing quickly, when they're green. That's not what I would call roughage in this context. I mean, it's roughage compared to grains, but the best goat growth happened every year in spring. That stocking rate experiment was designed to debunk this myth, really, that the stocking rate of goats is 25% greater than the stocking rate of sheep. I just talked a lot about that. If you're fully stocked a farm, you're going to run into big trouble if you put a lot of goats on there, and it depends on whether they've got kids and how many kids they've got. Stocking rate is about energy supply, really, as a broad term, and there's only so much energy produced on your farm. So if you put a lot of animals on your farm, then they won't do very well because they won't be well fed. There's a question that's been put that on a fully stocked farm, you can add 10% of goats with no effect on the carrying capacity. Well, as soon as you put 10% more goats on, you are affecting carrying capacity, but you're going to be heading into the overstocking rate position. Because remember, it's a fully stocked farm. So that's saying, for example, you had 10,000 DSE, can you put another 1,000 on? And the evidence we've just shown you here is that that's probably not going to be good for the animal's body condition score. It won't be good for their internal parasites. They'll be outcompeted by the sheep. And that's not going to be very good. You cannot get a goat fat. Well, you can. I could talk a lot more about that because I've been involved with a lot of carcass evaluations with goats. But I just showed a graph showing that even in autumn, we had goats with condition score above 3. At the very same time, we had goats condition score less than 2. Adjacent paddock, same genotype. The only difference was the stocking rate. And some people used to say that goats were an internal parasite hazard to sheep. Well, it could be, but certainly when we compared wether goats and wether sheep, that wasn't the case at all. In fact, it was helpful to have the sheep were beneficial for the goats. So I just want to conclude. Thank you for staying with us. We've covered a lot of territory. This has been an introduction, I suppose, to some important goat grazing essentials, and I really hope that this is helpful to people in avoiding major risks and help to improve both the production and welfare of your farm goats. So there we have it.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Bruce. I'm surprised you haven't lost your voice. That was a fair marathon, but that was all very interesting. Yeah, thank you for that. If anybody's got any questions, now's the time to ask.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. That was actually very interesting. Sorry, I'm not sure what's going on with my camera. It's all over the place. Just so I cross-graze my goats with cows, and I'm just wondering what you would think about the worm count, because, I mean, as you said, cows are designed for eating quite long grass as well. So, yeah, I'm just wondering how what you would think about the worms in that sort of situation.
Yes, so the intestinal parasites differ between sheep and cattle and goats, and that can be beneficial. So there's been some reports about having goats and cattle being beneficial, but it does depend where you are. And if you're in the warmer areas with summer rainfall, you can get a lot of homunculus and other worms, and so it might not be true. So it's these days best practice is about monitoring. I'm not going to talk to you about best practice internal parasitism because there's others now better qualified to do that. But some farmers have said that they really like putting goats over their longer pastures first. So that's sort of reflecting this issue about goats doing well when the pastures are a bit longer. And I suppose if there's any or browse or anything, then goats have the first shot at that. It's going to depend on your setup. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, they just go together.
Yeah. Well, it's not necessarily, look, yeah, if they're well fed, that one of the key things, I suppose, is that if the goats were well fed and in good body condition, they're going to be much more robust about any challenge that comes their way, whether it's poor weather or internal parasites. If we went back to those live weight graphs at the same seasonal conditions, the goats I had at the low stocking rate didn't really have an internal parasite challenge. I mean, that was a really good year. It was a really good year, and it kept raining, and there's lots of pasture, and everything was primed up for internal parasitism. So the well-fed goats were able to resist that to a much better extent. It was only the poor goats that were being out-competed, and they've got less energy, and then suddenly there's more parasites. The animals use a lot of energy fighting off internal parasite infections, and we do too. Humans, we're always fighting things off. But some people say maybe a quarter of our energy intake's there to help our immune system work properly. So if you think of it that way, keeping them well fed
and keeping warm too. I guess they put a lot of energy into keeping warm. We've had a really cold winter.
Chat. Oh, any tips on avoiding ring barking trees?
Ring barking trees. Yeah, fence them out. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I had goats. So my work was done at a research institute where we had some irrigated paddocks. We had some of those paddocks had trees in them, eucalyptus trees, and the goats did start biting bark, chewing the bark. I went down there and did a few measurements to try and work out how much bark was being eaten by a goat per day. I mean, it's pretty rough. It wasn't very much. It was less than a gram a day, I think. So this is goats being inquisitive, really, and having that ability to with their slightly curved jaw and so on, to actually take bites out of bark. It's very helpful in some weed control exercises, particularly like sweet briar rose. The fact that goats will take bites out of the bark is helpful, but for trees, you really just have to fence them out, don't you? You've got to keep them away, because even if you've got 100 goats and they just take one bite a day, it adds up. It causes a lot of damage. So, but I think it's the same sort of advice with sheep, and especially planted plantations, unfortunately. I don't think there's any silver bullet. I did know the people at the Werribee Zoo at one stage, and they were trying to prevent the giraffes from grazing the trees. So at the zoo, the Werribee Zoo, they were feeding the giraffes, hoping the giraffes would graze, and they had hay on offer. But of course, giraffes like browsing the tops of trees. And Bob Peace, who used to be the electric fencing guru for many years, he said at one point they just tried electrifying the trees, which is I'm not recommending it. This is what he said. And of course, the giraffe comes along and takes a bite out of the tree and receives a shock. So that seemed to work, but that's not going to be safe practice. You wouldn't want to do that, really.
Yeah, I don't think we'll recommend that one. She says, okay, goats are much worse than sheep when it comes to ring barking, but yeah, I've had plenty of experience with merinos ring barking as well, giving them everything possible to supplement them to try and find out if they need something, but I think it's purely boredom or curiosity, and they actually tend to attack our sugar gums more than any other tree. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, well, it could be. I mean, there's been people. I've talked to people over the years about grazing goats in orchards and places, and yes, at certain times, especially when the sap starts to flow, about this time of the year, the trees are starting in early spring, late winter, trees are starting to get ready to flower. So deciduous trees, and the goats somehow or other sense or they experiment. That's the thing about being inquisitive. So the myth about goats eating everything is the observation that if you look at goats, they'll often go around and take a bite out of lots of things. They'll eat dead leaves. They'll chew the fence post. In house, if they're in houses, they'll bite things on the clothesline, chew tin can. They're just being inquisitive. They're basically exploring the environment. And then they generally will say, well, hang on a minute, the thing that's most useful to eat today is this, it's ryegrass or it's something. And so it's that inquisitive behavior, that experimental testing, which is getting exacerbating this sort of problem. So it's useful for goats in very mixed environments where you've got lots of different plants. So what, like during the year, which plants are about to flower or the sap flow or the leaves are growing, they sort of work that out. And that's very advantageous. It's seen in weed control projects quite a lot. So that's something, Georgie, we can talk about at another time. Just what does all of this mean when it comes to, say, running a weed control program with goats? How do you put that to benefit? Yeah.
You got any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone coming along and those who listen afterwards. And thank you very much, Bruce, for giving us your time and your expertise. It's fascinating. It's always fascinating listening to any of the things that you have to say. So, yeah, looking forward to our next couple of sessions. And, yeah, thanks again.
No worries. You're welcome.